The dust had not yet settled on Owen Archer's boots when he knocked on the wrong door, and everything that followed would change the course of two lives so completely that neither of them would ever be able to say, with any honesty, that they wished it had gone differently. It was the autumn of 1873, and the Kansas plains stretched out in every direction like a bolt of amber cloth unrolled by God's own hand, vast and indifferent and heartbreakingly beautiful. The grass had gone golden with the turning of the season, and the sky above it wore that particular shade of blue that only existed in October on the frontier, deep and cold and infinite. Owen Archer had been riding for 3 days straight with only a folded scrap of paper to guide him, a paper that read Elliston Farm, 2 miles north of the creek fork, red door, and he had followed those directions with the confidence of a man who believed the world arranged itself according to his expectations. He was 31 years old, brown from the sun, lean from the trail, with dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck because he had been too busy the past month to find a barber. He had good hands, a working man's hands, with a scar across the left palm from a barbed wire incident outside of Abilene 3 years prior. He had been a ranch hand most of his adult life, and before that he had spent 2 years working cattle drives up from Texas, and before that he had been a boy in Missouri who dreamed of open country. He was not a complicated man in the way that some men were complicated, but he was not simple either. He felt things deeply and said them rarely, which is perhaps the most dangerous kind of man there is when it comes to matters of the heart. The homestead he arrived at had a red door. That was the thing. The door was unmistakably red, painted the color of autumn apples, and the house itself was a solid timber-frame structure with a covered porch and 2 windows facing the lane, and there was a kitchen garden to the east side that had been well tended even as the season wound down. Owen pulled his horse, a steady brown gelding named Patch, to a stop at the gate and checked his paper again. 2 miles north of the creek fork, red door. He had counted the miles carefully. He dismounted, looped Patch's reins over the fence post, and walked up the path to the porch. He knocked 3 times with the flat of his knuckle. The way his mother had always told him was polite without being demanding. The woman who opened the door was not what he expected, though he had not known enough about his destination to have formed an expectation in the first place. She was 27 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned up in the practical way of women who have work to do and no time to fuss, and her eyes were the color of creek water in sunlight, somewhere between green and gray depending on the angle. She was wearing a worn but clean work dress of indigo cotton, and her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and there was a smear of flour on her right forearm that she had not noticed. She looked at him with the measured assessment of a woman who had learned, out of necessity, to judge a stranger's character in the first 30 seconds. "Can I help you?" she said. "I'm looking for Elliston Farm," Owen said, holding his hat in both hands the way he always did when addressing a woman he did not know. "I was told there was work available. A Mr. Elliston wrote to the ranch foreman in Wichita and said he needed a hand for the winter months." Something shifted in the woman's expression. It was subtle, the kind of shift that only happened behind the eyes, a small interior weather change. She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then she said, "Mr. Elliston passed away 8 months ago." Owen felt the awkwardness of the moment like a weight on his chest. "I am sorry, ma'am. I did not know." "No," she said quietly. "I suppose the letter was sent before he took ill. He was already making plans for the farm when the sickness came on." She looked past Owen's shoulder at the land, and there was something in her face that was not quite grief anymore, but was the territory just past it, the flat, exhausted plain that comes after grief has burned itself down. Then she looked back at him and he saw her make a decision. "You have come a long way," she said. "Come inside, I will put coffee on." Owen Archer stood on the porch of the wrong homestead, holding his hat, with nowhere else to be and no particular reason to decline. "That is very kind of you," he said, and he stepped through the red door. The inside of the house was spare but not poor. There was a cast iron stove against one wall, a solid oak table with 4 chairs, a braided rug on the plank floor, and a shelf along the far wall holding a Bible, a medical almanac, and what appeared to be 3 volumes of poetry. The curtains were white muslin, and they moved slightly in the draft from the open door. The whole place smelled of wood smoke and fresh bread, and something herbal that Owen could not immediately identify. "I am Hester Ellsworth," the woman said, setting a pot on the stove. "The farm belonged to my late husband, James Elliston. I kept my own name on the deed when we married, which caused considerable comment in town at the time, but it has proved useful since." There was a dry humor in her voice that surprised him pleasantly. "Owen Archer," he said, setting his hat on the edge of the table when she gestured for him to sit. "I apologize for arriving without warning. I did not know the situation had changed." "How could you?" She moved around the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had been doing everything alone for a long time. The railroad office in Wichita would not have known either. "Letters take their time out here, and circumstances change faster than letters travel." She set a mug in front of him and poured coffee that was dark and strong. "Tell me about yourself, Mr. Archer. Where are you from originally?" "Missouri," he said. "I have been working cattle since I was 18. Ranch hand mostly, some trail driving early on. I know fence work, horse management, crop rotation if needed. I can fix most things that break." He paused. "I am not trying to talk myself into a job that may not exist anymore. I just want you to know I am not going to be any trouble to you." Hester sat down across from him with her own coffee and looked at him directly, which was something he noticed right away. She did not look away when she spoke to him. Some women on the frontier had learned a kind of practiced invisibility around unfamiliar men, a way of keeping their eyes slightly averted, and he understood why. But Hester Ellsworth looked at him like she was reading a document she needed to understand completely. "The job does exist," she said. "More so than ever, if I am honest. James had plans to expand the winter pasture and reinforce the north fence line before the hard weather sets in. There is also the matter of the roof on the barn, which is holding together by faith more than timber at this point. And I have 20 head of cattle that need tending through to spring." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "What I do not have is money to pay what a man would expect from a full ranch operation." "What do you have?" Owen asked. She met his gaze steadily. "Room and board. A fair wage, smaller than standard, made up with room and board and a share of what the cattle bring in spring. It is not nothing, but it is not what you could get from a larger outfit." Owen thought about the ride back to Wichita. He thought about the boarding house where he had been staying, which smelled of cabbage and other men's boots. He thought about the fact that he had no particular place to be, no family waiting, no other letter in his pocket. He looked around the clean, spare kitchen with its movable curtains and its shelf of poetry books, and he thought about the woman sitting across from him who had looked at a strange man on her porch after 8 months of being alone and said, "Come in anyway." That required a particular kind of courage that he respected enormously. "I will take it," he said. She blinked as if she had expected him to negotiate or decline. Just like that," he said. "Where do I start?" The barn roof was worse than she had described, which he discovered the following morning when he climbed up to assess it in the gray October light. 2 of the crossbeams had warped from the summer heat and cracked at the joint, and 3 sections of the cedar shingles had separated enough to let weather through. The interior showed the evidence: dark water stains on the south wall and a section of hay that had gone moldy from the damp. He spent the first 3 days on nothing but the roof, working from first light to last, replacing the damaged beams with timber he found in a neat stack behind the barn that James Elliston had apparently purchased and never had time to use. Hester brought him lunch on the second day, setting a tin plate with bread and cold beef on the fence post below him without interrupting his work. He noticed that she did not stand and watch him, the way some people did when they were checking up on hired help. She left the food and went back to the kitchen garden, where he could see her through the afternoon pulling the last of the autumn squash and stacking them in a wooden barrow. She had 6 chickens, a cow named Margaret, a mule called Absalom, the 20 cattle, and a vegetable garden that would have done credit to a woman with twice her resources. She had clearly been maintaining all of it alone since James Elliston died in February, and the fact that she had managed it spoke to a stubbornness of will that Owen found himself admiring in a way that was neither polite admiration nor professional respect, but something warmer and less defined. He slept in the barn, on a cot he had hauled in from the tack room, with a wool blanket and his own bedroll on top. It was cold but not unbearable, and Patch was good company in the way that horses always were, breathing slowly in the stall next to him, occasionally shifting his weight in the darkness. On the 5th day, Owen fixed the north fence line. On the 6th, he rode out to check the cattle, who had drifted further south than Hester had realized, and spent a full day moving them back to the winter pasture and reinforcing the fence stakes that had been loosened by the rain. When he came back in the evening, there was a proper hot supper on the table and Hester was sitting in the chair by the window reading one of her poetry books, and she did not look up immediately when he came in to wash his hands at the basin. "Cattle are back on the north pasture," he said. "I reset about a dozen stakes that were working loose. The fence itself is solid." "Thank you," she said, still reading. "Are you always this formal with hired help?" he asked, not unkindly, as he dried his hands. She looked up then. The lamp on the table was lit against the evening dark, and in its light her eyes were more green than gray. "I am not certain yet what you are," she said. "I'm a man who fixed your barn roof and found your cattle," he said. "So you are," she agreed, and something at the corner of her mouth moved upward slightly. "Sit down and eat then, Mr. Archer." He sat down and ate, and she set the book down and ate across from him, and they talked. It was tentative at first, the careful conversation of two strangers who are still feeling out the boundaries. She asked him about Kansas, how he found it compared to Missouri. He asked about the farm, how long she and James had been here. She told him they had come out in 1869, that James had been a good man with a vision for what the land could become, that they had worked together for 4 years building something she still believed in even without him. Owen listened to her talk about James Elliston without any of the discomfort men sometimes showed when a woman spoke about a dead husband with both love and grief. He simply listened, and she noticed that. She talked about the town of Millhaven, 6 miles east, where there was a general store and a post office and a small church that she attended more out of community loyalty than deep religious conviction, and where the people were sometimes kind, and sometimes the particular flavor of unkind that came from small communities where everyone knew everyone's situation and had opinions about it. She had been on the receiving end of some of that unkindness since James died. The well-meaning suggestions that she sell the farm and go back to Ohio where her sister lived. The less well-meaning suggestions that a woman alone on a homestead was an irregularity that needed correcting. She said all of this without bitterness, just factually, the way she might describe the weather. "Do you want to go back to Ohio?" Owen asked. "No," she said, without a moment's hesitation. "This is my land. James and I built it together, and I intend to see it become what we planned." Owen looked at her across the supper table in the lamplight, with the wind beginning to pick up outside and the plains going dark and the cattle settled in the north pasture, and he thought that he had never met a woman quite like this one, and that he had not known he was looking for one. He did not say any of that. He was not that kind of man, or at least he had not been before. Instead he said, "What did you and James plan for it?" And she told him in more detail than she had probably intended, because he kept asking questions and seemed genuinely interested. A proper winter barn, large enough for all the cattle. A windmill for the west well, which was unreliable in dry summers. An orchard along the south slope, which she believed had the right soil for apple trees. A second bedroom eventually, which had been planned for children who had not arrived before James took ill. She stopped at that last part and looked down at her plate, and Owen did not push into that silence because it was not his to enter. After a moment she refilled his coffee and asked if he had seen much of Kansas before this, and they moved on. October deepened into November, and Owen Archer remained. It was not a decision he made so much as a condition he fell into, like water finding a low place. Each day there was more to do than the day before, and each evening there was supper at the table and conversation that grew gradually less formal and gradually more real. He learned that she read widely for a woman of her circumstances, that she had an opinion about almost everything and would share it if asked, and increasingly if not asked. He learned that she had a sharp sense of humor that she deployed sparingly, like a spice, so that when it appeared it was all the more effective. He learned that she woke before dawn every day without exception, and that she sang sometimes while she worked in the kitchen, old songs from Ohio that she probably did not know she was singing. He learned that the flour smear on her forearm that first day was a constant feature, that she was an excellent cook and knew it, and that she would not accept compliments about it gracefully but would instead wave her hand dismissively, and then make the same dish again with small improvements. She learned things about him too, though he offered them more slowly. She learned that he could read, which she had not assumed but was pleased to find. She learned that he had been engaged once, to a girl in Wichita, who had ultimately married a banker's son and moved to St. Louis, and that he had not been devastated so much as quietly relieved, which told her something important about what that relationship had actually been. She learned that he was meticulous about the care of his horse and his tools, and that he took the same meticulous approach to everything he touched on the farm, that he did not do things halfway. She learned that he sometimes stood out on the porch in the evening and looked at the stars for a long time without saying anything, and that this was not melancholy but something more like prayer. One evening in mid-November she came out and stood beside him on the porch without being invited, and they stood in comfortable silence for a while looking at the sky. "My father used to know all the constellations," she said eventually. "He would take me out to the field behind our house in Ohio and name every one." "Do you remember them?" "Some," she pointed. "That is Orion, there is the Bear, that cluster there is the Pleiades, the seven sisters, though I can never count more than 6 myself." "The seventh is dim," Owen said. "You can only see it on very clear nights." He paused. "My grandmother used to say the seventh sister hid herself because she was ashamed of marrying a mortal while her sisters married gods." Hester turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her. They were standing close in the cold air, close enough that she could see his breath. "That is a very romantic story for a cattleman," she said. "My grandmother was a romantic woman," he said. "It must have been contagious." There was a pause in which both of them became aware of how close they were standing, and then Hester said, "It is cold. I should go in," and went inside, and Owen stood on the porch for a while longer looking at the seventh sister until it was too cold to stand still. November brought hard weather. A blue norther came in off the plains in the 3rd week of the month, dropping the temperature 20 degrees in 2 hours, and Owen spent 2 solid days reinforcing the cattle shelter and hauling extra hay while the wind tore at everything with what felt like personal resentment. Hester worked alongside him during the worst of it, her breath coming in white clouds, her hands red with the cold, not asking for help but accepting it when he handed her things, and not objecting when he took the heavier loads without comment. On the second night of the norther, when the wind had settled into a sustained howl, the kitchen was warm with fire and they sat close to the stove, and she got out the medical almanac and read to him about the habits of migrating birds while he oiled harness leather, and it was so ordinary and so comfortable that it frightened him a little. The following week, on a cold, bright Wednesday, Owen rode into Millhaven for supplies. Hester had given him a list written in her clear, precise hand, flour and salt and lamp oil, and a new pot hook she needed for the kitchen. He went to the general store, which was run by a man named Harold Prout who had small eyes and a large opinion of himself, and Harold Prout looked at Owen Archer across the counter with unconcealed curiosity. "You are the fellow staying out at the Elliston place," he said. It was not quite a question. "That is right," Owen said. "Working for Mrs. Ellsworth." "Is that so?" Harold Prout began filling the order without any particular urgency. "People have been wondering about that situation." "What situation is that?" Owen asked, keeping his voice level. "A widow woman, alone out there with a hired man she does not know, no family nearby to speak of." Harold Prout set the flour on the counter. "It is the sort of thing people notice." "I expect they do," Owen said. He took the supplies and paid for them and left without further conversation, but he rode back to the farm with a heaviness on him that was partly anger and partly something more protective than anger, a feeling that something he had not known he valued was being casually insulted by men who had no right to an opinion about it. He told Hester what Harold Prout had said. He told her straight out, the way he would have told a friend, without softening it. She was at the kitchen table with the account ledger open when he said it, and her pen stopped moving. "I know," she said quietly. "I have been aware of the talk. Does it trouble you?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What troubles me is that a woman's good name is considered her most valuable possession, more valuable than her land or her livestock or her own judgment about who she allows on her property. What troubles me is that no one asked Mr. Prout what he thought when James was alive and we were working this farm together, but now that I am alone, suddenly my business is everyone's business." She closed the ledger. "What does not trouble me, Mr. Archer, is the specific fact of your being here, because your being here has been nothing but a benefit to this farm, and I will not apologize for it." He looked at her for a moment. "I could sleep in town if it would help, ride out during the days." "That would be ridiculous and wasteful and cold," she said. "Besides, you are already here." She opened the ledger again. "I will handle Mr. Prout." She did handle Mr. Prout in her own way, by going into town the following Saturday and going to every business on the main street and being seen, plainly and straightforwardly, as a woman who was running her farm and managing her own affairs, without apology and without explanation. She was civil to everyone she met. She asked after children and elderly parents. She made her purchases efficiently and made no mention of Owen Archer whatsoever, which was somehow more effective than any defense she could have offered. By the time she left Millhaven, she had reclaimed something. Owen watched her ride out that morning and ride back in the afternoon, and when she came in and hung up her coat and sat down with a cup of tea and a look of calm satisfaction, he thought that she was the most formidable woman he had ever encountered, and that he was in very serious trouble where his feelings were concerned. He did not tell her that. Not yet. December arrived, and with it the first real snowfall, 2 inches overnight, that turned the plains into a white and silent country, beautiful and isolating in equal measure. Owen spent a morning breaking ice on the water troughs and moving the cattle to a more sheltered section of the pasture, and when he came in for midday he found Hester baking, the kitchen warm and smelling of cinnamon, and she had put holly branches on the windowsill in acknowledgment of the approaching holiday. "Do you celebrate Christmas?" he asked, unwinding his muffler at the door. "I do," she said. "I was planning to go to the church service in Millhaven on Christmas Eve. I usually take a pie." She looked over her shoulder at him from the stove. "Do you celebrate it?" "My family did," he said. "I have not had much occasion for it in recent years." "Well," she said, in a tone that did not quite constitute an invitation but was its clear neighbor, "you are welcome to come to the service if you like, and there will be dinner here on Christmas Day." "I would like that," he said, and she turned back to her baking with what might have been the beginning of a smile. There was a moment, 2 days before Christmas, when everything shifted between them in a way that could not be shifted back. Owen had come up to the house in the late afternoon to bring the account of what supplies they would need for the cattle through the rest of the winter, and he had found Hester on a stepladder reaching for something on the high shelf above the pantry, and the ladder had shifted on the uneven floor, and she had grabbed for the shelf, and the shelf had held but she had jolted hard, and he had been across the kitchen in 3 strides with his hands on her waist before he had made a conscious decision to move. She caught herself. The ladder stabilized, she was fine. But for a moment she was gripping the shelf and he was gripping her, and then she came down the 2 steps of the ladder and they were standing very close together in the kitchen with his hands still on her waist and her hands on his forearms where she had grabbed for balance, and neither of them moved immediately. She looked up at him. He was taller by a good measure, and she had to tilt her chin, and the winter light from the window was in her eyes making them entirely green. "I am all right," she said. "I know," he said. But he did not step back for another 3 seconds, and neither did she, and those 3 seconds contained something that could not be taken back. He released her and took a step to the side and set the supply list on the table and said, "I will check the ladder legs. The left one is uneven." And she said, "Thank you." And they both carefully did not look at each other for the rest of the evening, which told each of them everything they needed to know about what was happening. Christmas Eve in Millhaven was cold and clear, with stars showing hard and bright above the little church where the congregation gathered in wool coats and good intentions. Owen drove Hester in the wagon, which he had hitched and ready when she came out in her best dress, a deep blue wool that he had not seen before, with her hair done differently than usual, slightly softer at the edges. He helped her up onto the wagon seat without being asked, and she took his offered hand without hesitation, and the 4 miles to town were cold and companionable and full of small talk that meant something other than what was said. In the church, they sat together in a pew near the back, and when the congregation sang the Christmas hymns, he discovered that she had a fine, clear voice, and she discovered that he did not, and she laughed quietly at his expression of defeat during the second verse of "O Holy Night." And that quiet laugh in the candle-lit church was one of the best things he had heard in his adult life. On the drive home, the stars were extraordinary, and she pointed out the Pleiades again and said, "There she is, the 7th sister. You can see her tonight." He looked at the cluster and then looked at her in the starlight, this woman who had opened her door to a stranger and handed him coffee and talked about poetry and stood her ground against small-town opinion, and sang hymns in a voice like water over smooth stone, and he thought, very clearly, that he had ridden to the wrong place by mistake and ended up exactly where he was supposed to be. He did not say that either. He was working up to it. Christmas dinner was ham and roasted squash and potatoes and cornbread, and a dried apple pie that she had made from the last of the summer's put-up fruit, and he ate more than he had eaten in months, and told her sincerely that it was the best meal he had had in years. She accepted this compliment, which was uncharacteristic, by saying, "I am glad. It was a good ham." After dinner they sat by the fire, she with her book of poetry and he with a copy of the Wichita newspaper he had brought from town, and the fire made the room warm and golden, and outside the snow was beginning again, softly, without urgency. After a while she read something aloud without explaining why, just started reading it and let it speak for itself, and it was a poem about the prairie, about being so far out in the open land that the sky pressed down like a kind hand, and when she finished she was looking into the fire and he was looking at her. "Hester," he said. She turned to look at him. She must have heard something in the way he said her name, because she did not say anything, just waited. "I came to this farm by mistake," he said. "I had a piece of paper with the wrong address on it, and I followed it here, and you opened the door, and I have been here 2 months, and I am going to say something that may make things awkward between us, but I have decided I would rather risk the awkwardness than not say it." She had set the book down now. She was watching him with that direct, reading look that he had learned to recognize as her full attention. "I have not felt about another person the way I feel about you," he said, "in a very long time. Maybe not ever. And I am not asking for anything tonight except that you know it, because it did not seem right to keep sitting across from you at that table every evening, and helping with your cattle, and standing on the porch looking at the stars, and have you not know what is actually happening with me." The fire popped. The snow fell. Hester Ellsworth looked at Owen Archer in the Christmas firelight and was quiet for a moment that he experienced as approximately 1 geological epoch in length. "James has been gone almost a year," she said finally, and her voice was careful, not closing a door but not throwing it open either. And I have not been certain what I am in this time, who I am without him. We were partners for 4 years, and that is not a small thing to have ended. I know, Owen said. I am not saying no, she said. I want to be clear about that. I am saying that I need time to trust what I feel because the last year has changed everything I thought I understood about my own life, and I would rather be honest with you about that than tell you something simple that isn't true. Honesty is the only thing I want from you, he said. I can wait. She looked at him for a long moment. You are not the man I expected to find on my porch, she said softly. You are not the woman I expected to find behind the door, he said. And yet here we both are. Something in her face relaxed, not entirely, but enough. She picked up her book again, and he went back to his newspaper, and the fire burned low, and eventually she said good night and went to her room, and he went out through the cold to the barn, and Patch snorted at him in the darkness, and he lay on his cot for a long time listening to the snow and thinking that he was a patient man, and that patience, in the right circumstances, was not passive at all but the most active kind of faith there was. January on the Kansas plains was a serious business. The cold was not the polite cold of Christmas, but a determined, relentless cold that came down from the north with nothing to stop it, and the work of keeping the cattle alive and the farm functional in January was not light. Owen was up before first light every morning, breaking ice on the troughs again, checking that the cattle shelter was holding, making sure the hay supply was sufficient. There were 2 days in the second week of January when the temperature dropped so low that he worried about the cattle in a serious way, and he moved the most vulnerable of them into the barn and spent the night checking on them every 2 hours, sleeping in short shifts on his cot with his coat on. Hester brought him coffee at 2 in the morning on the second of those nights, walking through the dark from the house in her heavy coat with the lantern held high, and she sat with him in the barn for an hour while they watched the cattle and talked quietly, their breath visible in the lamplight, and it was in its strange way the most intimate thing that had happened between them, more intimate than the moment in the kitchen with his hands on her waist, because it was entirely about trust. Go back to the house, he said eventually. I have this. I know you do, she said, but I would rather be here. He did not argue with her. She stayed another hour and then went in, and he watched her lantern move across the snow toward the house and felt something in his chest that was entirely new and entirely certain. By February, things had changed between them without any single conversation marking the change. It happened the way that river bends happen, gradually and then completely. She started calling him Owen rather than Mr. Archer. He started calling her Hester in a way that was different from how he had said it at Christmas, less formal, more like something he said to himself when she was not there. The suppers became longer, the conversations ranging further and further from practical things into personal things, opinions and memories and questions about each other's inner lives that they would not have asked 2 months earlier. She told him about growing up in Ohio, about her father who knew the constellations and her mother, who was an expert quilter, and her sister Clara, who had written to her every month since she came west and who worried about her constantly. She told him about coming west with James, the specific terror and exhilaration of it, the first sight of the Kansas plains, and the feeling that she was standing at the edge of the world, and that the world was bigger than she had known. She told him that she had been happy with James, genuinely happy, and that she did not feel guilty saying so because happiness was not something to feel guilty about. She told him that she had also been lonely in their marriage in ways she had not fully articulated to herself until after James was gone, that there had been things she wanted to talk about that James had not had much patience for, books and ideas and the larger world, not because he was a bad man, but because they were different kinds of minds, and that she had loved him anyway, and that was the truth of it. Owen told her about Missouri, about his parents who had both died of cholera when he was 20, and who he still missed in a general ambient way rather than a sharp specific way, the way you missed weather that had passed. He told her about the trail drives, the particular brutal beauty of moving thousands of cattle across the country, the way it made you feel both insignificant and capable. He told her about the engagement in Wichita, filling in details he had not given her before. The girl's name had been Margaret, which was also the name of Hester's cow, a coincidence that made Hester laugh properly for the first time in his presence, a full laugh, unreserved, her head tilting back. He thought he might have been falling in love with her for weeks, but that laugh was the moment he knew it for certain. "The cow is better company," she said when she recovered. "That is entirely possible," he agreed, and watched her laugh again. He helped her write a letter to her sister Clara in February, which is to say he sat at the table while she wrote it and she read parts of it aloud to him to check if they sounded right. And when she described him to Clara, she said, "A good man, a capable one and pleasant company." And she said it without looking at him, but her ears turned slightly pink, which he filed away carefully. In March, when the worst of the cold had broken, and the first tentative suggestion of spring appeared in the grass, Owen rode into Millhaven on a Thursday and went to the general store. Harold Prout was behind the counter as always with his small eyes and his large opinions. "Mr. Prout," Owen said. "Archer," said Harold Prout. "I am going to say something to you plain," Owen said, keeping his voice entirely even. "I have been at the Ellsworth farm since October. I have been hired as a farm hand. I have done that work honestly, and I intend to continue doing it. Mrs. Ellsworth is a woman of integrity and capability, and she does not deserve to have her reputation talked about in ways that have no basis. If there is anything you feel the need to say about the situation at her farm, I would ask you to say it to me directly rather than let it run around town on its own legs." Harold Prout looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who had expected a different conversation. "I have not said anything particular about it," he said, which was half true and both of them knew it. "I am glad to hear it," Owen said. "I will take the usual supplies." When he got back to the farm and told Hester, she looked at him with something he could not quite name at first, and then he recognized it as the expression people had when they were moved but did not want to show it. "You did not need to do that," she said. "I wanted to," he said simply. She turned back to the stove and stirred something, and after a moment she said, "Owen, yes, you said at Christmas that you would wait. I did. I have been thinking," she said. She turned around, holding the spoon, and looked at him directly in that way she had that made him feel like she was reading the most important document she had ever come across. "I have been thinking that I know who I am. I worked that out somewhere around February, in the barn at 2 in the morning, actually. And I have been thinking that what I feel when you are in this room is not something I want to keep at arm's length just because it frightened me at first." Owen set down the supplies bag very carefully. "I am not asking you to make any promises," she said. "I am simply telling you that when you are ready to say what you said at Christmas again, I am ready to hear it differently." He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps, and when he reached her, he was not looking at the floor or the wall or the pot on the stove. He was looking at her face, and she was looking back at him, and he said, "Hester, I love you. I did not come here intending to, I did not plan it, and I could not have stopped it." She was still holding the wooden spoon, which she now set on the stovetop with great precision, and she reached up and touched his face with one hand, her work-roughened, flour-dusted fingers against his jaw, and she said, "I love you too, Owen Archer. I believe I have for some time." He kissed her, and she kissed him back, and the kitchen smelled of whatever was on the stove and wood smoke, and the beginning of spring coming through the window. She had opened an inch that morning, and outside the cattle were moving in the north pasture, and Patch was in the barn, and the land was turning green at its edges, and the whole ordinary beautiful world of the farm continued exactly as it always had, except that everything was different now. Spring came to Kansas with its particular prairie extravagance, the grass coming in thick and green, the wildflowers appearing along the fence lines in colors that seemed excessive after the gray of winter, and the Ellsworth farm came alive in ways that were both literal and otherwise. The cattle were fat and healthy from the winter management, and the south pasture, which had been underused, was now available for expansion. Owen and Hester spent long evenings at the kitchen table with the farm ledger and paper, planning what they could do with the spring and summer, talking about it with the easy partnership of people who have already settled the important question and can now address everything else. She planted the kitchen garden in April with Owen helping, which was not something she had originally invited him to do, but which happened naturally because he was there and willing, and she had a lot of ground to cover. He proved to be a methodical and patient gardener, which surprised her. He said that his mother had kept a kitchen garden and he had been made to help with it as a boy and had retained more than he expected. She gave him the bean rows, which were his mother's specialty, he said, and watched him plant them with an attention to spacing and depth that was almost professional. "You are going to be insufferable if the beans are better than mine," she told him. "I will be gracious in success," he said, pushing soil over the last seed. "No, you will not," she said. "You will be insufferable." He looked up from the garden bed and grinned at her, and it was a different kind of grin from the careful, restrained expressions of the autumn, unguarded and real, and it changed his whole face in a way that made her heart do something it had not done in a very long time. The letter from Clara arrived in April. Hester's sister had written before, steady monthly letters as promised, full of family news from Ohio, but this letter was different. Clara had been reading between the lines of Hester's letters, which Hester had perhaps not written as carefully as she thought, and Clara wanted to know who Owen Archer was and in what capacity he figured in Hester's life. The letter was written with Clara's particular combination of sisterly concern and barely contained delight, and Hester read it at the table with Owen, watching her expression shift from self-consciousness to amusement. "She wants to know about you," Hester said. "What will you tell her?" Hester looked at him over the top of the letter. "I will tell her the truth," she said. "That a cowboy arrived at my door looking for the wrong farm, and I let him in, and now I appear to be in love with him." "That is an accurate summary," Owen said. She wrote back to Clara that same evening, and she read him parts of what she wrote, and this time her ears turned pink, but she did not pretend she was not reading it to him on purpose. In May, a practical problem arose in the form of a man named Calhoun, a land speculator who had been buying up homesteads east of Millhaven and had now turned his attention toward the Ellsworth place. He arrived one morning in a black coat and a new hat, driving a rig that was too fine for the dirt road, and he offered Hester a price for the farm that was fair on paper, but represented the end of everything she and James had built. And he offered it with the polished confidence of a man who assumed the answer would be yes. Hester stood on the porch with her arms folded and heard him out completely, which was her way. She gave people the full courtesy of being heard before she responded. "No, thank you," she said when he had finished. Calhoun adjusted his hat. "Mrs. Ellsworth, you are one woman running a cattle farm alone. It is a significant challenge." "I am not alone," she said. "And I am not interested in selling." Calhoun looked past her at Owen, who had come up from the barn when he saw the rig and was now leaning against the fence post at a distance that was close enough to be present but far enough to make clear he was not inserting himself unless needed. "The hired man," Calhoun said, in a tone that was meant to diminish. "My partner," Hester said, and she said it clearly and without hesitation, and Owen, at the fence post, felt the word land in him like something struck on an anvil. Calhoun went away. He did not look pleased about it. That evening Owen was quiet at supper, the thoughtful kind of quiet that Hester had learned to read as something forming in him. She let it form. After supper he helped clear the table, which he had gotten into the habit of doing, and then he said, "You called me your partner today." "I did," she said. "Is that what you want?" he asked, in a formal sense as well as every other sense. She looked at him steadily. "What are you asking me?" He was quiet for a moment, putting words to the thing that had been forming all evening. "I am asking," he said, "if you would be willing to make this permanent, all of it. The farm and the planning and the supper table and the porch at night and the cattle and the garden and everything else. I am asking if you would marry me, Hester." She was quiet too, for a moment, not because she did not know the answer, but because she wanted to hold the moment before it moved into the next thing. She had been here before at this question with James, and the answer had been different then in the sense that she had been different, younger and less certain of herself and less certain of what she actually wanted from a life. She was certain now. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Owen." He smiled, and she reached across the table and took his hand, and that was that. The question had been asked and answered in a farmhouse kitchen in Kansas in the spring of 1874, without roses or speeches, with supper dishes still on the table and the smell of wood smoke in the air, and it was exactly right. They were married at the church in Millhaven on the 15th of June, 1874, a warm, bright Saturday, with the minister performing the ceremony and a small congregation of neighbors who had come around to the situation at different speeds, but who had, on the whole, come around. Harold Prout was not present, but his wife was, and she cried at the ceremony, which no one had expected. The woman from the farm east of the creek, a widow named Dolores Hatch, who had become something of a friend to Hester during the winter, served as witness. Owen's only close friend in the territory was a former trail-driving colleague named Robert Mesa, who had come up from Wichita for the occasion and shook Owen's hand with the enthusiasm of a man who had been waiting a long time for his friend to get himself sorted out. Hester wore her best dress again, the deep blue wool, which she had let out slightly at the seam to give it more movement. Owen wore his good coat and a new shirt he had bought in Millhaven, and a pair of boots that he had polished with more attention than he usually gave to anything that was not a horse or a fence. He was waiting at the front of the church when she walked in, and when he saw her, his expression was not the overwhelmed, helpless look that some grooms wore, but something quieter and more permanent, like a man recognizing a landmark. The minister asked the questions and they answered them. And when Owen said, "I will," his voice was even and clear and meant every syllable. And when Hester said, "I will," it was in the same tone, entirely and deliberately chosen. Robert Mesa rode back to Wichita the following morning, well-fed and teasing Owen about finally knowing where he lived. Dolores Hatch brought a pound cake to the house as a wedding gift, and stayed for tea and told Hester that she thought Owen Archer seemed like the right kind of man, which in Dolores Hatch's vocabulary was the highest compliment available. Summer on the farm was work and warmth, and the specific domestic happiness of two people who were well-suited and who knew it. The bean rose came in spectacularly, which Owen acknowledged with the grace he had promised, quietly and without crowing, but with visible satisfaction every time they appeared at the dinner table. The cattle were moved through the summer pasture on a rotation that maximized the grass, and the herd came through the summer in excellent condition, healthy and heavier than last year. The apple trees that Hester had been planting were ordered from a nursery in Missouri and arrived as saplings in late July, and they planted them together along the south slope on a hot afternoon, and when the last one was in the ground they stood back and looked at the small row of green, and Hester said, "In 10 years those will be giving us apples." "In 10 years," Owen agreed and took her hand. Clara came to visit in August. She traveled from Ohio by rail to Wichita, and then by stage to Millhaven, which was a journey of some difficulty, and she arrived on the farm in the afternoon of a Tuesday looking dust-covered and elated, and somewhat overwhelmed by the scale of the sky. She was 30 years old, a teacher with strong opinions and a quick laugh, and she was clearly inspecting Owen Archer with the focused attention of a protective sister, even as she embraced him warmly because Hester had told her to. Owen bore the inspection with patience and good humor. He took Clara out to see the cattle, explained the farm operations in enough detail to satisfy her practical mind, and answered her questions about his background and his plans directly and without evasion. By the third day, Clara had clearly decided he was acceptable, and on the fourth day, he found her in the kitchen teaching Hester a pie technique from Ohio, and they were both laughing, and he understood that the family approval he had not known he was waiting for had been given. Clara stayed for 2 weeks and made herself useful in the way that family does when they come to a farm and are not too proud to help with the work. She and Owen developed an easy teasing friendship, which Hester observed with deep satisfaction, and when Clara left to go back to Ohio, there were promises made about return visits that everyone intended to keep. Autumn came around again, and with it, the anniversary of Owen's arrival at the wrong homestead. On the exact morning of it, a year to the day from when he had knocked on the red door, Hester made a proper breakfast of eggs and ham and biscuits and set it on the table, and when he came in from the barn and sat down, he looked at the spread with some surprise. "Is there occasion?" he asked. "1 year," she said, sitting across from him with her coffee. "1 year since you knocked on my door." He looked at her. "I had the wrong paper and the wrong address," he said. "You had exactly the right address," she said firmly. "You just did not know it yet." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his, and they had breakfast together with the morning light coming through the window and the plains going gold outside in the October light, and everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. The following spring brought something new. Hester told him in April, with the directness and certainty that were the most characteristic things about her, that they were going to have a child. Owen's reaction was not the one he might have predicted if you had asked him in advance to describe it. He had expected to feel nervous. Instead, he felt something enormous and clear, like the sky after a rainstorm when everything was clean and bright, and you could see further than usual. He held her face in his hands and looked at her and said, "Are you all right? How do you feel?" "I feel well," she said. "I have felt sick in the mornings, but it is passing. I am told that is how it usually goes." "We need to think about the bedroom," he said, and she laughed at him. "You have exactly the right priorities," she said. The second bedroom that James Elliston had planned was now built. Owen and Robert Mesa, who came up from Wichita for a week in May specifically for this purpose, framed it out on the east side of the house, extending the structure in a way that the original build had clearly been designed to allow. It was a proper room with a window facing east and good plank floors, and a door that fit square in its frame. And when it was done, Owen stood in it for a moment and thought about all the different kinds of hope that had gone into this room's existence. Hester wrote to Clara immediately. Clara wrote back a letter of such enthusiasm that it arrived damp from where some of the exclamation points had bled through the paper, or so Owen claimed when Hester read it to him. The baby was born in November of 1875, a boy, arriving in the farmhouse with the help of the doctor from Millhaven and Dolores Hatch, who had delivered children before and was calm and useful in a crisis. Owen waited in the kitchen in a state of sustained, barely controlled tension, keeping the fire going and the water hot, and doing exactly what he was told by Dolores Hatch, which was to stay out of the way and be ready. The boy announced himself with appropriate volume. The doctor came out and said mother and child were well, and Owen went in and found Hester tired and incandescent, and holding a small person with enormous dark eyes and a furious expression that would, over time, become a look of specific thoughtfulness that was unmistakably Hester's. "What do we name him?" Owen asked, sitting on the edge of the bed and looking at this new person who had changed the shape of everything. Hester looked at the baby, then at Owen. "James," she said, "for his sake and for mine." "Is that all right?" Owen looked at her steadily. "It is more than all right," he said. "It is perfect." They named him James Owen Archer, and he was a good baby by general report, healthy and solid and interested in the world from the first days, which was entirely consistent with who his parents were. Dolores Hatch came to see them a week after the birth, and held James Owen for a quarter of an hour with the comfortable authority of a woman who had held a great many children, and told Owen that he was going to be a good father, which she said in the same way she had told Hester that Owen was the right kind of man, and which carried the same weight of considered assessment. The year that followed was the fullest year Owen Archer had ever lived. James Owen grew and changed with the speed that infants do, becoming more specific as a person with each passing week, developing preferences and opinions, and a smile that appeared first for Hester, and then, with a small delay that Owen was magnanimous about, for Owen as well. Owen carried him out to see the cattle in the spring, which was not strictly necessary but felt important, the handing over of the land to the person who would eventually care for it. Hester recovered her full strength by March and went back to the full work of the farm with James Owen in a cloth carrier strapped to her chest, which she had devised from a pattern she found in the medical almanac, and which worked with remarkable efficiency. Owen watched her move through the kitchen garden with the baby secured to her front and thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that she was the most capable person he had ever known. He told her that one evening after supper, when James Owen was asleep in his room, and they were sitting on the porch in the warm spring dark listening to the land breathe. "The most capable person," she said. "Not the most beautiful or the most witty. All of those too," he said, "but capable covers the most ground." She leaned against his shoulder, which she did now without thinking about it, the easy, unconscious closeness of two people who have stopped being careful with each other. "Tell me something," she said. "What?" "Tell me what you thought when I opened the door that first day." He was quiet for a moment, remembering. The October afternoon, the wrong farm, the red door, and the woman behind it with flower on her arm. "I thought you were going to send me away," he said. "And when you did not, I thought you were the most hospitable woman I had ever met. And then I thought that there was something in your face, something I could not name yet, like a country I could see from a distance but had not entered yet." She was quiet against his shoulder. "And then you gave me coffee," he said, "and I sat at your table and I thought I would like to sit at this table for a long time." She laughed softly. "And here you are." "Here I am," he agreed. The apple trees on the south slope were growing steadily. They would not produce fruit for several more years, but they were healthy and the leaves that summer were thick and green, and Owen tended them with the patience of a man who understood that some things needed time and that time, given to the right things, was never wasted. Life on the frontier was not without its difficulties, and Owen and Hester were honest about that between themselves. There were years when the rain was short and the grass did not come in as it should, and the cattle required more management and the garden gave less than expected. There were years when the market prices for cattle were low, and the calculations in the ledger required creative thought. There was a hard winter in 1877, when one of the cattle shelter walls gave out in a storm, and they lost 3 animals to the cold before Owen could reinforce the structure. And that loss was felt in both the ledger and in a quieter personal way, because each of those animals had been part of what they were building. But the difficulties were met the way they had always met things, together, at the kitchen table with the ledger and the coffee, speaking plainly about what was real and what could be done about it. There was no situation that arose that they could not face better for being two rather than one, and Owen thought sometimes about the person he had been before, moving from ranch to ranch with no fixed destination, and how he had not known what he was missing because he had not known it existed. James Owen Archer grew into a child of the farm, curious and hardy, following Owen through the cattle work at an age when following was all he could do, helping in the garden at an age when helping was mostly getting in the way, and asking questions constantly about everything in a way that was entirely his mother's. Owen answered every question he could, and when he could not, he said so, and they found the answer together in the almanac, or in the agricultural journal that Hester ordered from Wichita and read cover to cover. Clara came back to visit in 1877, and this time she brought a friend, a quiet schoolteacher named Joseph whom she married the following year, and the correspondence between Clara in Ohio and Hester in Kansas became a steady, warm thread of family connection that both of them relied on. Clara and Joseph had children of their own in due course, and Hester's letters back east were full of the particular satisfaction of an aunt who receives news of nephews and nieces, and who knows that somewhere her own child is growing up with cousins he would meet someday. In the spring of 1879, Hester told Owen she was expecting their second child, with the same directness as the first time and the same steady certainty in her eyes. This time Owen was not frozen by the enormity of it but met it with the settled joy of a man who has been happy before and knows exactly what the feeling is. "Another room," he said. "Not immediately," she said. "James Owen can share for a while." The second child was a girl, born in December of 1879 in the same farmhouse, and with the same help from the Millhaven doctor. They named her Alice, which was Hester's mother's name, and she arrived with considerably less noise than James Owen had but proved, in the months that followed, to have an equally strong will expressed through more selective means. Where James Owen asked about everything loudly, Alice observed everything quietly, and then demonstrated that she had missed nothing. Millhaven grew during those years, the way frontier towns did, new buildings going up, a second general store that had the side effect of making Harold Prout significantly more pleasant in his general behavior, a school that opened in 1878, which James Owen would eventually attend, and where Hester became involved in the school board because she had opinions about education and the fortitude to express them in public settings. Robert Mesa came up from Wichita on a visit in 1878 and spent 3 days on the farm, helping Owen with a fencing project on the expanded east pasture. In the evenings he sat at the supper table with Owen and Hester and James Owen and watched the way they moved through the domestic world together, the easy fluency of two people who have learned each other completely, and he told Owen privately, walking out to check the cattle one morning, that he had never seen him look like this. "Like what?" Owen asked. "Like you are exactly where you are supposed to be," Robert Mesa said. "Like you have been here your whole life and have no intention of being anywhere else." Owen looked out at the land, the north pasture in the early light, the farmhouse with its red door visible from here, the apple trees on the south slope. He thought about a morning in October 1873 when he had followed a piece of paper to a door that turned out to be the wrong door, which turned out to be the right door, which had turned out to be the beginning of everything. "That is exactly what it feels like," he said. "The years layered themselves on the land the way seasons do, each one building on the last, each one adding something to what was already there." The orchard began to produce fruit in 1883, 10 years after Owen's arrival, just as Hester had predicted, and the first autumn apple harvest was a significant event on the farm. They made cider and dried apples and apple butter, and a quantity of pie that would have satisfied a regiment, and Owen ate his share of it with the satisfaction of a man who had helped plant those trees and understood the time they had needed to become what they were. James Owen was 9 by then, old enough to help with the harvest in real ways, carrying baskets and sorting fruit with a methodical attention that was recognizably his father's. Alice was 3, and spent the harvest days in Hester's vicinity, studying the whole operation with her characteristic quiet intensity, and occasionally attempting to eat an apple that was larger than her face. Owen stood at the edge of the orchard one afternoon during that first harvest and looked at his family moving through the trees in the autumn light, Hester with the apron she wore for harvest work and her hair coming loose from its pins, because it always did by midday, James Owen carrying a basket with more care than strictly necessary, because he was 9 and wanted to be taken seriously, little Alice sitting in the grass with an apple in both hands and a look of absolute determination. The light was the same golden October light that had been on everything the day he rode up the lane with a piece of paper and the wrong address, and the red door was visible from here, and the land was more his than it had ever been anyone's because he had lived it and worked it and loved the woman who had built it. He was not a man who made speeches, even to himself. But he thought, standing at the edge of the orchard, that this was what a life was supposed to look like. Not the one he had planned, not the one anyone would have predicted from the outside, but the true one, the one that had been waiting at the end of a lane he had turned down by accident. He walked back into the trees and picked up a basket and helped with the harvest. That winter, with the apple butter on the shelf and the cattle settled and the children asleep down the hall, Owen and Hester sat by the fire on a December evening that was almost exactly like the first December evening he remembered. The fire low and warm and the snow outside, and the plains going quiet. She was mending something, and he was reading the newspaper, and the familiar, ordinary beauty of it was not lost on him, had never been lost on him, because he had come to it from a life without it and knew its value precisely. "Owen," she said. "Yes. Are you happy?" He looked up from the newspaper. She was not looking at him, but at the mending, with that particular expression she sometimes wore when she was asking something that mattered. "Hester," he said, "I was 31 years old when I knocked on your door and had no idea whose door it was. I had been moving from one place to the next since I was 18, and I had never once felt the way I feel every single day in this house, on this land with you." He set the newspaper down. "I am so happy it is almost embarrassing to say it plainly." She looked up at him then, and she was smiling, and it was the same smile that had started somewhere in the first month, the one that began at the corner of her mouth and built slowly, the smile she gave when something was exactly right. "Good," she said, "because I intend to keep you here indefinitely." "You could not remove me with a team of oxen," he said. She laughed, and the fire popped, and the snow fell on the Kansas plains, and outside the red door the land lay quiet and full of what they had made of it together. The years that followed continued to be good ones, not without struggle, because the frontier offered struggle freely and without apology, but good in the sense that matters, built on something solid and real. James Owen grew into a young man of 12, 13, 14, inheriting his mother's directness and his father's patience in a combination that seemed promising for whatever life he chose. He was serious about the farm work without being solemn about it, capable and curious and occasionally exasperating in the way that young people are. And Owen loved him with the full, uncomplicated love of a father who has been present for every year of his child's life, and does not take a single one of them for granted. Alice at 6 was a person of considerable character, quiet in the way her mother was not quite, more precise, the child who watched before she moved and who, when she did move, moved with a certainty that was almost startling. She had Owen's dark hair and Hester's creekwater eyes, and she had formed strong opinions about the orchard and the chickens and the naming of things, and she had named all 6 chickens and every one of the cattle, and expected everyone in the family to use those names consistently, which they did, because Alice Archer had a way of making her expectations clear that it seemed unwise to ignore. In the autumn of 1887, when James Owen was 13 and Alice was 7, Hester told Owen that she thought the time had come to take on a proper farm worker, not because Owen was not managing, but because the herd had grown and the orchard was producing at full capacity, and she had been thinking about a small dairy operation using 3 of the cows, and the arithmetic simply required another pair of capable hands. They hired a young man named Thomas Wells, 19 years old, from a farming family in the next county over who had too many sons and not enough land. Thomas Wells was a hard worker and a quiet person, and he had the good sense to understand the operation of the Ellsworth farm within the first week, and to fit himself into it without disruption. He lived in the barn the same way Owen had, on the same cot, which had been replaced twice since 1873, but occupied the same position, and he took his meals at the kitchen table with the family, and he called Hester Mrs. Archer and Owen Sir, until Owen told him to call him Owen, at which point he called him Mr. Owen, as a compromise that satisfied no one but Thomas Wells, and they all let it stand because it was harmless. The dairy operation became, within 2 years, one of the more profitable aspects of the farm. Hester managed it with the same systematic intelligence she brought to everything, keeping records and adjusting the rotation, and developing a relationship with the general store in Millhaven that meant their butter and cheese moved reliably. Thomas Wells handled the morning milking with an efficiency that freed Owen to focus on the cattle and the orchard, and the farm settled into a new productive rhythm that Hester had planned and Owen had trusted, and that had come out exactly as she said it would. "You are always right," Owen told her one evening, not for the first time. "I am usually right," she corrected, "about practical matters. On questions of poetry, I am more willing to entertain alternative views." "On questions of poetry," he agreed. They had been married 14 years by then, and the things that had been carefully chosen in the beginning were now deeply habitual in the best sense. The morning coffee shared in the kitchen before the children were up, the porch in the evenings when the weather allowed, the ease of moving through a day beside someone who knew you completely and had chosen to be there anyway. Owen thought sometimes about the things the years had carried, James Elliston's plans that Owen had finished building, the grief that Hester had walked through and out the other side of, the distance he had covered from Missouri to Kansas to this particular piece of land where it turned out everything had been waiting. He thought about how a single wrong turn, a single piece of paper with an error in the address, had redirected everything. He was grateful for it every day. He was not always eloquent about that gratitude, because he was still the man he had always been, someone who felt things deeply and said them selectively. But Hester knew. She had always been able to read him more accurately than he read himself, and she knew the texture of his happiness the same way she knew the texture of the land, from having paid close attention to it for a long time. James Owen at 15 began talking about one day moving west further, California or Oregon, with the particular restlessness of a young man who had grown up in a wide open place and still somehow wanted more horizon. Owen listened to this with the patience of a man who had himself been a restless young man and knew what it meant and what it did not mean. He did not discourage it. He told James Owen about the trail drives, about the size of the country, about the different kinds of land that existed out beyond Kansas. He also, without making it a lesson, showed him the farm ledger and walked him through the arithmetic of what had been built here over 15 years, not to bind him to it, just to make sure he understood what he was looking at when he stood on this land. James Owen listened to all of it with the serious attention he gave to most things, and he said, "Did you always know this was where you wanted to be?" "No," Owen said honestly. "I did not know it until I was already here." James Owen thought about that for a moment. "But you stayed." "Your mother opened the door," Owen said, "and once she did that, I never had a good reason to leave." His son looked at him with the expression of a young man trying to understand something that was not yet entirely available to his experience. "Was that enough?" he asked. "Just someone opening a door?" "It was the right door," Owen said, "and the right person behind it. When those two things line up, a man recognizes it even if he does not know immediately what he is recognizing." James Owen nodded slowly, taking that in. He was going to leave someday, Owen knew, because he was his mother's child and his own person, and the world was large and he was young, and that was how it was supposed to work. But he was also a part of this land, this orchard, this farm that two people had built together from a wrong turn and a cup of coffee, and a door that had been opened out of something that was partly hospitality and partly courage and partly, though she might not have admitted it at the time, some instinct that recognized the right person even before the mind had caught up. On a Sunday afternoon in October of 1888, exactly 15 years from the day Owen Archer had first ridden up the lane with a folded piece of paper and the wrong address, the family was together on the porch in the autumn light. Hester was in the rocking chair with the current letter from Clara in her hand, reading a passage aloud that had made her laugh. James Owen was sitting on the porch steps with a piece of paper and a pencil, doing something mathematical for the farm accounts that he had taken over managing with Owen's oversight. Alice was in the yard with two of the chickens who had somehow escaped their coop and were being herded back with a patience and method that was entirely characteristic. Owen leaned against the porch post and looked at all of it. The red door behind him, the lane down which he had ridden 15 years ago with no idea where he was going or what he would find, the orchard on the south slope, fully productive and beautiful in its autumn colors, the north pasture with the cattle moving slowly in the evening light, the farmhouse that had grown to include the extra bedrooms and the covered back porch, and the workshop Owen had built 3 years ago on the east side. The land, green and gold in the October light, stretching out in all directions under the Kansas sky that was that particular deep October blue. Hester looked up from the letter and found him looking at it all, and she knew what he was doing because she had seen him do it before, this taking stock, this deliberate acknowledgement of the life they had made. 15 years today, she said quietly. 15 years, he agreed. She set the letter in her lap and looked at him with those eyes that were green or gray depending on the light, and that he had been reading for 15 years and that he expected to be reading for the rest of his life. And she said, "Was it worth it? All of it?" The wrong address and the stranger on the porch and all the years since. He looked at her. He looked at James Owen with his pencil and his arithmetic and his future spreading out ahead of him. He looked at Alice with her determined chickens and her particular way of being in the world that was entirely her own. He looked at the orchard and the cattle and the red door and the sky. "Hester," he said, "there is not a map in existence that could have brought me here on purpose. And there is nothing in the world I would trade it for." She looked at him for a moment, and then she smiled, the full smile, the unreserved one, and she reached out her hand toward him, and he came and sat on the arm of the rocking chair beside her, and she leaned into him. And James Owen glanced up from his arithmetic and went back to it with the comfortable indifference of a child who has always known his parents to be like this. And Alice got the last chicken into the coop and latched it with satisfaction, and turned to look at the porch with the assessing gaze of a 7-year-old deciding whether there was anything interesting happening. There was, and there wasn't. There was just the family on the porch in the October light, which was everything, which was the whole of it, which was the particular ordinary extraordinary life that had begun when a cowboy knocked on the wrong door, and a woman looked at him and said, "Come in anyway," and neither of them had ever found a good reason to leave. The land spread out around them, amber and gold and green, vast and generous under the Kansas sky, and the red door stood open behind them, letting out the warmth of the house, and the apple trees were heavy with the last of the season's fruit, and everything that had been planted in the soil and in their lives had grown into exactly what it was meant to be,